Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you all for joining us this morning for Art Basel Conversations. My name is Sylvia Chivaratanan, and I help to organize the Art Basel Conversations and Art Salon, which happens here every day throughout the run of the fair. Today we have a very distinguished panel of speakers, Klaus Biesenbach, Lynne Cooke, and Anne Goldstein. And our moderator, András Szántó, will be introducing them each. He's a writer and advisor to cultural organizations and foundations, and a regular contributor to the art newspaper. He teaches art business and cultural communication and marketing in New York. He's a European who has lived half his life in the US. So please help me welcome our panel today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for turning out so early this morning. I know it's very hard to get over your hangover cures. Thanks to Art Basel, as always, for surrounding the commercial stimulus with some intellectual stimulus. And thanks to all I see many friends and colleagues and students from both sides of the Atlantic. We're here to talk about something that I think is very important and timely, which is similarities and differences between Europe and the United States, especially when it comes to the arts and especially when it comes to museums. And I think we all have heard and read a lot about how globalization is supposed to erase differences between nations, between continents. We've heard a lot of that, but I think we all at the same time understand that there are very, very profound and enduring differences that do persist in values, in perceptions, in ways of doing business, in sort of frames of mind around the arts and around museums. But what exactly are these differences? Joining us today are three art world luminaries that I think don't need much of an introduction, although I will try to sort of very, very briefly say a little bit about each of them later on, but very quickly, they are in the same order as you can see them up on the screen. So it's Klaus Biesenbach, currently of MoMA PS1, and Goldstein, currently, maybe not, the order has been changed, and Goldstein, currently of the Stedelijk in Amsterdam, and Lynne Cooke in the middle, who's the most traveled of all, most recently in the US, now here in Madrid. Please give them a hand in advance for all of their thoughts. Now you may ask, why should we talk about America and Europe right now? The way that the idea of this conversation came about was that last year we were talking with colleagues at Art Basel, and we'd noticed that there was actually a spate of announcements of major curators who had moved across the Atlantic to assume new positions. In this case, two very recent transitions from the United States to Europe, one less recent transition from the US to the United States, but there had been many others. And we thought that that was kind of interesting, that there was something interesting about that in and of itself. But there was something a year ago, also a little bit more profound going on, which was, I don't know who was here last year. We sat here exactly a year ago with 5 museum directors from Europe and the United States, and we were talking about the crisis. And our perception was that European museums and American museums at the time were confronting very different realities. American museums were really at the low point in the crisis. Their endowments were tanking, they were laying off staff. It was a very, very dark and dismal time in many museums. Meanwhile, the European museum directors on the panel last year were quite sanguine about the situation. They were quite optimistic. Many of them expressed relief that they were shielded from the storm, they were protected by state subsidies, and indeed they were taking advantage of the situation in many respects. But what a difference a year makes. Right now, it's almost the opposite situation. It's Europe that seems to be heading into more turbulent waters. In the United States, museums are recovering, endowments are back, some museums are hatching new plans. So again, a reminder that the realities and the context and the situations of museums on the two sides of the Atlantic can be quite different. But putting aside those sort of cyclical differences, what I hope we can talk about today are sort of three areas of contrast, or three layers of the onion that I hope we can peel away. Beginning first, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the overall cultural context in which museums find themselves, the overall differences in the place of the arts in general and museums in particular in society. And then I hope we can talk a little bit about differences in how museums are run, who gets to make decisions, how are those made, why are those made, where does the money come from, and so forth. And then thirdly, and I think for this panel, perhaps most importantly, I hope we can get into a little bit to the question of the different texture of exchange that happens inside the museum between objects and curators on the one hand and the public on the other hand. That is to say, what are the different frames of mind and references that people bring to that encounter? And I hope we can cover most of that today. We have about an hour, and we will take questions at the very end. But as a way of getting into this, we were talking a little bit before the panel, and I warned my friends here that I'm going to ask each one to ease us into this topic by giving us an anecdote, a kind of epiphany of when they first realized that they're in a different kind of place. That when it was after they took on their new job, they said, aha, okay, this is a different kettle of fish. So I'm going to ask each of them, and as I do that, I'll say a few words about who they are, although I think for this audience, they really don't need much of an introduction. And I warn in advance that I can really, truly only scrape the surface of their unbelievably intimidating and impressive resumes. We could spend all day just reading their lengthy biographies. We're going to start with you, Lynne. Mm-hmm. And Lynne is currently at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, where she's deputy director and chief curator, and it's a role that you took on a year and a half ago, roughly. And before that, she was at DIA in New York, where she remains a curator at large, and she was there for 17 years. So this is a very big switch for you, although not the first in your life, because you're an Australian who moved to New York. So among her many, many accomplishments, she co-curator of the Carnegie International in '91, artistic director of the Sydney Biennale. She's taught and lectured very extensively. Among her many, many exhibitions, Richard Serra, Jorge Pardo, Ronnie Horn, Rosemary Truckle, Anne Hamilton, and on. And of course, a widely published author as well. So, Lynne, you get to Madrid. Okay. When was it that it sank in that this is a different context?
It sank in very fast. I was installing the first exhibition I'd worked on, which was a retrospective of Zoe Leonard's work. And it was a very comprehensive show and involved many, many photographs and a long installation period. And that seemed to be going well. But the day before we were opening, there was an enormous amount still to do. And we'd asked for this to be done and that to be done. And nothing seemed to happen. And then there'd be a 2.5-hour lunch, and many people don't work after lunch. And it was seeming a little precarious to me. And then the next morning, there's a press preview at noon, and suddenly at 10 o'clock, an army of people appeared who'd never been sighted before, and there were 8 women washing the floor with buckets, and people were putting labels up, and everything happened within this last hour and a half, and it looked perfect. It was perfectly finished. And I realized that this, and with hindsight now, I realize that this is absolutely the way it happens in Spain. It's a big drama at the end, and everybody's involved, and there's a huge amount of flurry, and there's a tremendous sense of theater as things come to an opening. And it's totally the opposite of what I'd
So
experienced
how would this
before.
have played out in your previous post? 2 years of planning, care for
Yes,
execution?
everybody knowing exactly what to do, everything finished a day or two beforehand, usually, give or take technical disasters, and just a sense that things happened on schedule.
Was this a kind of pleasant discovery for you? Like, oh, you can do it this way as well?
Well, I guess I do it this way because that's the way it is. It's a very different way of thinking. It has an adrenaline rush that people get off on, and I can see the excitement of it. It's perhaps not necessarily my preferred mode, but it's like lunch is at 3 o'clock. I'm
Right.
always hungry at 1 o'clock. My
Yes.
body just hasn't quite got there.
So these are the deep sort of cultural threads that are simply there that you have to adapt to. Okay, well, great. Anne, you're next. So Anne is the most recent Atlantic hopper. She has actually barely arrived. Her museum actually hasn't opened yet or reopened yet. She's General Artistic Director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, where she arrived in January. And she's now working on her first exhibit. She was, before that, for a very long time, 25 years, at LA MOCA, serving for a long time as Senior Curator for Contemporary Art, but in many other positions before that. At LA MOCA, she oversaw the permanent collection, organized many renowned thematic and single artist exhibitions, many of which traveled. So I think through that, you certainly had this experience of how things play out in Europe. She's exhibited Martin Kippenberger, Felix González Torres, Barbara Kruger, and on and on. Also a prolific writer, many of her catalogs, of course, are definitive texts in their areas. And I realized that for you, this is all new, and you're just getting used to it. But say what was the moment when you realized that you're now somewhere else?
I think that it was very interesting coming to the Stedelijk and coming to a museum that has been closed and in a very long and extended renovation and expansion that started 6 years ago, that was supposed to have been completed 2-3 years ago, and still doesn't have a definitive end, although we hope for the end of next year. So it's coming into a situation where the museum has been functioning on certain levels and not functioning in a public way. It had a temporary building for about 4 years, and then for the last 2 years, there has not been a building for programming, although certain things done out in the city and loans of the collection and so on. So for me, it was coming into that situation, but also kind of jumping in. It was many things, jumping from being a curator to a director, jumping from one country to another, jumping from a museum that almost disappeared to a museum that kind of has disappeared, and to wanting to kind of walk in swinging and hit the ground running. And I think that, of course, one of the first things you encounter then is the different ways things are done, and really understanding a fundamental difference in the institutions, coming from a privately funded, trustee kind of owned institution to a truly publicly owned situation. I think it was interesting going into a closed museum where I actually had to ask. I have to ask permission to look at the collection. I have to ask permission to go into the buildings. And
You mean you don't have the keys?
I don't have the keys. Yeah. So it's a different sense of ownership internally and actually of the staff. I mean, you're really a custodian. You're really there as a really responsible party on behalf of an institution. The museum does not own its buildings nor its collection. So when I first met the owners of the collection are the city of Amsterdam. I met the alderman, and she said, if something happens to a work of art, the first person you call is me. And so they're just kind of learning all of the different processes. So there's many anecdotes, but I think really just understanding that a different sense of ownership. And I think any museum is in a public trust, but certainly a publicly funded institution has a different sense of entitlement and expectations coming from the outside.
And probably even compared to an American public museum, not that we have that many, but even compared to that, it's a little different. And we'll get to these administrative issues in a minute. And I'm really glad because the two anecdotes seem to work very well, because we have sort of the deep culture, and then we have the sort of administrative culture being different. And we'll go into each of these as we go along today. But let's get Klaus into the conversation as well. He's our veteran Atlantic crosser on the panel, because he made the definitive journey now a little while ago. He's, of course, director of MoMA PS1, where you've been curating since the 90s, and curator at large of MoMA. And he came, of course, to New York from Berlin, where he funded Kunst-Werke, the Institute for Contemporary Art, in '91, and also founded the Biennale, the Berlin Biennale, in '96, and he remained founding director of both of those institutions. In case you haven't been reading the newspapers, Klaus, who became film and media curator in '04, has been steadily expanding his range of responsibilities at MoMA, and has led a number of very important initiatives there, and certainly on behalf of performance art, but also in other areas of the museums, workshops, acquisitions. For those of you who've been to New York recently, the Marina Abramović show just closed, the Greater New York show just opened, so he's a very busy guy. And again, too many artists to name who've been on your exhibitions, although some of the names overlap between all of you. So tell us about your perceptions of these two continents on which you seem to find yourself all the time.
I see it perhaps as two cities, first of all. I see it Berlin, New York. And I'm very often asked, oh God, you're so anti-cyclical. How dare you to leave Berlin when everybody moves to Berlin and you're moving away? I was in Berlin from '89 to 2004. So that's 15 years. And having founded KW and the Berlin Biennale, having worked with so many artists, I think I did my tenure in Berlin 15 years.
Right.
And so going to New York in 2004 is actually not really true, because I think I started commuting between New York and Berlin in '92. So that's 18 years of commuting on a monthly basis between the two cities. And there were so many exhibitions that were done for both cities, like early on, Paul Pfeiffer, Terrence Simon, or Mexi's a very big Mexico City show with Francis Ali. So they were always made for both cities. Anecdote. Since I'm doing this for 18 years, and I often wake up and I don't know where I wake up, so it needs me a while to find out where am I. We recently opened the Marina Abramović exhibition, and Marina was sitting, there were 2 chairs and a table in the main atrium, and then on the 6th floor was a quite monumental show where we had done a casting, we had looked at 200 younger or different performers, dancers, actors, and finally Marina had started training 39 of those 200, and it was a year-long process of training them and there was a workshop of 3 days, no talking, of endurance, of just lying down for a whole day, not moving. So we had all of these things, and we were so focused in this. And then the opening comes, and the whole museum is full, and our trustees are there, and everybody's there. And then the first person comes up to me and said, these people, they're all naked. Didn't you see that? They're all naked. And then the second person comes up and said, how did you sell this to the museum? These people are all naked. We're in America. And then I seriously had not thought about this.
Being German.
No, being European, because I think in Europe art is so much a consensus that art has a special set of rules. Art is consulted to get some secret truth and beauty out of everything. Art is a consensus in Europe, being something very, very powerful, whereas in the US, art is still difficult. You can see this, a politician, like, we had a very, very, very powerful politician from Germany who, like, read it in some German magazines. There was this kind of show. So she came, and she would walk right through the naked people. And the mayor of New York would never, ever, ever, ever get photo close to that occasion. Because
not with cameras around.
In the States, art is still difficult. And I think having not had any doubt about it, I was just like very doubtless with my colleagues, and the colleagues totally saw that. So we did it, but then at the opening, everybody said like, oh God. Then the press said, oh God, but everybody stayed cool. And then after the press went a little crazy for a week, and it ended up at Barbara Walters and David Letterman and every mainstream talk show. After everybody had his or her rage, it was fine. And then 3 months, all of the people were naked and nobody cared anymore. And they behaved, actually.
Well, I think that's all of those very revealing little windows into our broader topic, and that last one actually leads us really forward into where I was hoping to go. And I think we've had a little taste of the deeper cultural differences, administrative differences, and sort of the status of art, but that's exactly where I would like to go now, and as they say on CNN, dig a little deeper. And now we'll just chat for a while. But I'd like to sort of each of you to reflect, or whoever feels inspired, to tell me, and maybe you've answered this a little bit, in the simplest terms possible, what is your perception of the different place of art in society, in where you are now, or just.
I think what Klaus said about difficult is quite a good way of approaching it. That my experience in the States was you kind of had to anticipate trouble, where the trouble might come from, where the flare-ups might be, to do a kind of preventive action before the. It's not my experience in Spain. There's a great deal of freedom on that level. It's an extremely liberal society. We've never been asked about the content of a show beforehand. I was just co-curated a show with Douglas Crimp called Mixed Use Manhattan that has, amongst other things, Alvin Baltrop photographs of many of which show explicit sex on the piers in New York in the 70s. Nobody has asked beforehand, nobody's said we need to cordon off this room, we don't have to put up signage. This is a seamless part of the exhibition. It hasn't been pulled out and made some kind of
you
drama.
didn't have anguished meetings with your public relations staff about your damage control procedures?
Not at all. And from what I can see of all the programming, those kind of issues don't come up. It's culture is what people come to and then address in their own terms. It's not that there's some
or maybe
didactic function.
Maybe they even expect to be provoked.
No, I don't think they're looking to be provoked.
They just accept it. But does that also apply? I mean, sexuality or explicit works is one thing, but does that also apply to other areas beyond sexuality?
Well, religious subjects.
Political hot potatoes, religious subject, is that your experience as well?
Religious subjects probably more, but that's hearsay. I haven't actually witnessed the case, but that does come up certainly in the news from time to time. But within my experience of looking at exhibitions and literature and theatre, no, it's a very free society.
So greater tolerance. So it's a tolerance, as I understand it, that comes out of greater respect for art. Is that kind of what you're saying, Klaus?
I don't know, it's greater respect. I think that I can mostly talk of a German-speaking part of the European Union, but I would say, at least in my generation, it's a very secular society. So I remember every time I watch the Oscars or the music awards, and then comes this fantastic director, actor, and they thanking God. And I'm not against this, but I always realize that in Europe you wouldn't necessarily do that in a context like this. So what I'm saying is I think Europe is a very, very secular society, whereas America, the US, is still a very, very religion-driven society, where religion, where the mayor, the president, they go on public radio and TV and they say, oh, I have to leave now, I have to read the Bible. This is daily truth. So what does that mean? It means that I think with the non-believers, with the secular Europe, art took that function in society of being a secret place, a revealing place, a place of epiphany and wonder, a place of belief, a place of miracle, and therefore has a very strong support group. Even when you think all these collectors running and buying, it's a little bit like buying religious devotional objects. So I think that is strange in Europe, whereas in America, society has that different spectrum still, and art is still that slightly dangerous, slightly subversive, definitely for a politician dangerous, definitely for a public figure area you don't want to get too close to. You cannot get any public person in the US too close to art. It's still, and it's how many, I don't know how many, 30 years after Mapplethorpe and under Serrano, but it's still, you would still not get there. So the subversive otherness of art is still there and you feel it.
It's interesting though, because Americans feel very often and express very often that they're more open to innovation, to different ideas, that there's a dimension of the American self-image, that America is a more liberal, more open, more tolerant society, certainly more accepting of breaking of boundaries. So how do you reconcile those two things? Is that a delusion, or is that also true?
Well, I'm coming from the other side and from the American side looking toward...
As the token American
yeah,
on
as
the
the
panel.
token American on the panel. It is, we always were have been impressed by how much art is considered part of society, that artists are incredibly respected, because in the States, I think many artists feel that they're suspected, that there's, there's the suspicion. And it's not even based on issues of tolerance or difference or content, but just that they're doing, whatever they're doing is suspicious. And I think that it's also interesting for me about the differences back and forth, not just in terms of issues of content, which I do agree with you about, but also just who gets a show where. I mean, in terms of, at MOCA, we co-organized Lawrence Weiner's retrospective 3 years ago. The Stedelijk Museum organized a retrospective in the late 80s, and his first museum survey was in the 70s in Europe. So it's interesting how certain artists, and certainly an area of conceptual art that I've worked a lot in, noticing that just Dan Graham just gets his first American retrospective, Lawrence, that they wait till it doesn't happen sooner. It doesn't, that there's, it's hard, and again, maybe through the different financial systems, through the fact that we have to get funding, persuade, justify in a different way what we do. In the States, I feel that there's a different process of how things go on a schedule, or how you determine what you do is not, you're not necessarily always worried about, well, can I get it funded? And can I get support for it? So I think that it's interesting. That's always been a very perplexing and interesting situation, how certain artists it takes them so long to be shown in the US.
So just want to turn the dial a little bit. So let's acknowledge that that there is this kind of constraint, if you will, in America, a kind of public morality that is less tolerant of certain kind of aesthetic transgressions. What Europe has, on the other hand, is something else that may be a kind of constraint, which is the idea of art being seen as a kind of embodiment of a national culture, and of museums being national institutions. How does that change things, or does it? The fact that your museums are seen as major national institutions, that much of the art in there isn't just art, but it's also an emblem of a national tradition. Does that lead to a change in how you approach your work or your programming, or is that not really a major consideration?
I'm in a city-owned institution, so it's of course it's part of it's the center of a national network of modern contemporary art museums. It's definitely a national treasure, but also very locally identified and owned. I mean, it's an institution that has really been used by its citizens, identified. They all grew up going to the Stedelijk Museum. They all miss it terribly, which is very encouraging. And it is an institution that I've also been impressed with how much it has written about its own history. Books about its directors, books about the history of the institution's architecture, so much of an investment in its own history, and I think that is also something. I mean, I come from a museum that was very young, so it had I kind of witnessed its history. Coming into an institution that's 115 years old is also just a new encounter of how much it really lives with that history, and everybody knows it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the Reina Sofia is a museum that has responsibility for Spanish modern and contemporary art as well as international art. And in that sense, it's like the Tate or the Centro Pompidou. And there's always a debate between what the relative status of each is, in local terms, I think. But what's really interesting to me is, although it's the institution that looks after cultural patrimony, or perhaps because it does, patrimony is considered not just the artifacts, it's the discourse. And so there's a tremendous debate constantly around the reception or the interpretation of works. So when the collection was rehung, as this new administration under Manuel Borja Vilel came in, Guernica was recontextualized, and it caused massive debates for months. And that goes on with programming, it's not just about who's shown, it's about what the bigger story is, what the story and what the terms are in which the narratives are being defined. And
they weave that back into the whole debate about their patrimony. It's not just a technical question of the rehang and why didn't they...
It's about patrimony, but it's also about discourse.
Yeah.
It's not just about objects, and I think that's very different from my experience. Also, of course, there's no equivalent to this kind of institution really in the States. But the level of discussion, the fact that the discussion is philosophical and discursive, I think that's very different.
And in general, I suppose you're referring to the press as well as, I mean, obviously in professional publications there's a lot of discussion, but this really permeates into the public press as well?
There's a great deal of press. A lot of it's journalism, as distinct from high-level criticism, but it means that the institution's in the press every day for one reason or another. And it means that I think culture, when you look at the culture section of the newspaper, it's a big section with substantial articles. The discussion, and many of the people who are in the art world, as in Germany, I think, have degrees in philosophy and aesthetics rather than in art history, as in the English-speaking world, and that makes for a different type of discussion. So Rancière is as likely to be quoted as my Shapiro. It's a different kind of discussion, but it's one that many people from different sectors enter into. I think that's true in Germany
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, same perception. Okay, it's another interesting contrast we've discovered. Actually, it's one I haven't heard before, but the art historian versus the philosophical framework. Well, let's go from the, maybe let's switch gears a little bit now and go from the sort of sublime to the more technical questions. The differences in how these institutions are run. Let's talk, and then I do want to get back to these more subtle issues of how the discourse is different. But we can't have this discussion today without talking about the fact, about the differences between institutions that are privately run and funded and institutions that are state funded and run. And I think there's a lot of sort of cliches and shorthand about what that means exactly. It's not really as black and white as, you know, in America, all the museums are just private collectors getting together to run museums, and Europe is somehow about the state just sort of imposing its will. So I'd like each of you to sort of reflect on this a little bit and where you are on the scale of things, and in your experience going from one type of institution to another, how did that trade-off play out? What are the pros and cons of being in a publicly funded organization versus a privately funded one? Who'd like to go first? Klaus.
I do think the difference is not that black and white anymore, because I worked a lot in Japan in the 90s. And in Japan in the 90s, there were all these museums started or planned or built, but they were just built without having a budget planned in. And I thought that was an incredible phenomenon. All these contemporary and modern art museums pop up in every major city, but they didn't think about a staff, they didn't think about a collection, they didn't think about a budget to plan shows. And a little bit 10 years later, Europe looks like this, with a long tradition of having a Kunstverein, a Kunsthalle, a museum in every middle-sized city, but with the economy not necessarily being being incredibly strong right now. They look a little bit like these museums in Japan that have their buildings and their structure, but they don't have necessarily budget to plan shows and to go for new acquisitions. So I think that's slightly changing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if the economy, state economy, goes even a little weaker, it will even be more so the case. So that said, I think that sponsors, private collectors, donations will be more important in Europe. Whereas I think in America, the ideal museum has a variety of very, very strong trustees, of very, very strong donors, so that it can function like an institution, so that's independent from the donations. It can program just by the curators and directors' decisions. So I think in an ideal world, an American institution is based on that civic responsibility, like a hospital is, or like a library there is. You walk into a hospital and it has it's the Kimmel Hospital, or it's this and that hospital of a certain family. And you wouldn't expect that this family whose name is on the door will tell you which surgeon will take care of you. That's not how it functions, and it's also not how it functions that in a well-run museum there's this big name on the door and this name will tell the curators what to do. So I think there is an ideal of establishing an independence that's purely curatorial / directorial. I think it works in most museums really well. I think we were all a little shocked when economy tanked how fragile some museums are. We were all a little shocked when we heard about LA MOCA being in a deep emergency situation. But this can happen to a state-run museum here too. Just do 2 or 3 wrong decisions and I think you're there. That's not a miracle.
Klaus, do you ever feel at MoMA that in thinking about what you're putting on and how you're putting it on, that you have to worry about the trustees? Do you feel that pressure, or do you feel comfortably isolated from that side of things?
I'm not only comfortably isolated, I also feel supported going towards areas that I even don't know yet, which I think is a great point to be at. I think curators have different roles. So there are curators that are curator directors, and then there are director directors. I think my role, I'm more interested because my main profession is being curious, so I'm more like into discovery. So I would describe my role even now as some sort of director. I would call it like inventor / curator. And I can only say as a museum, I changed my role every half a year. In the 5.5 years I'm in the museum now. And the museum always supported this. So I actually do think that in a large enough institution, you are safely disconnected, but you are in a great way supported once you really want to gain new territory and make a case for it. Like we had no media department a couple of years ago, we had no performance department. So all these things are new territories, and if you make a case for it, you have quite a support.
Right.
And I couldn't imagine having done this in Europe because it's so slow sometimes.
So is this your experience as well? I mean, I know you're just getting started, although I think you're getting a quick education.
Yes.
That institutionally, a private ownership maybe gives a little bit more freedom?
In my experience, it might give less bureaucracy. I mean,
Less bureaucracy in which
in
case?
the States.
In the States.
But then, on the other hand, to generate anything, to apply for grants, to write the proposals, to go through the press and the media, I find actually oddly that Europe is more flexible. Well, I can only speak from my experience, but within Spain it's more flexible, that one can actually work much faster, though that would seem unlikely, because there are somehow there's an ability to find something and get behind it and not have to wait for approvals and funding and a series of committees, and that's refreshing. I mean, and there's not scrutiny at that level from politicians, nor at the moment, and I should touch wood, is there anything like that in terms of just counting sheer numbers of people through the door.
I was going to ask that exact question is where do you feel the greater pressure to generate audience attendance numbers? I mean, in the US there's an enormous emphasis on the body count. Is that, you're saying it's not so important?
Well, we're in the fortunate position of the numbers of people coming is
It's
increasing,
huge. Yeah.
and it's huge.
Yeah.
And that has to do with many factors, I think. Maybe even the relative unemployment, people are coming more, perhaps there's Guernica is a key attraction in the museum, there's a very active exhibition program, probably more than at many other institutes. There's a number of factors. But and maybe because the numbers are very high, there's not that pressure.
Right. So we're actually dispelling a number of myths here very quietly, or not so quietly. The myth of, this sort of Orwellian state that tells you what to do seems to be not quite what it is. But also, I think the myth of the private trustees sort of exercising their influence on curatorial decisions. I think journalists in particular almost take it as a matter of course that somehow the way museums work is trustees come along and they say, here's my collection, I want it on the wall. But I wonder what your reflections are.
I think that there can be those perceptions in the States, but I think that a museum that has everything in its proper place, and the director is responsible to cushion the curators so that they can do their jobs, to keep that separation, to field the various stakeholders. I think that an institution needs to know itself, ensure its identity, believe in itself, and fight for itself. I think that what's interesting in Europe is, and just the Stedelijk Museum has slightly shifted its kind of configuration. It's mostly publicly funded by the city of Amsterdam. It was privatized to the effect that the staff and I report to a board, a supervisory board, rather than the city. So the city is not our boss, but they hold our purse strings. So it's an interesting balance. But we do have to raise money, and this is a whole new encounter. The art of the give and get is very, from my perspective, underdeveloped and very unsystematized. I was very surprised to come in that there really weren't procedures or policies. Just kind of everything is catch as catch can, a contract here, a contract there.
Do you have a fundraising staff?
We have 2 people. 2 people,
How
which
many
is
people at MoMA are involved in fundraising?
more than our
200.
staffs, probably.
It's definitely a very large number.
Yeah.
Thank you for being so precise.
I mean, at MOCA at its height, it was 20 people. It was as big as the curatorial staff. The 2 biggest staffs were the curatorial staff and the fundraising staff.
And how much of your own time in your current jobs is spent with fundraising, roughly?
I would say that
At the Stedelijk.
At the Stedelijk, that's a big part of my job.
Yeah.
It was a part of my job at MOCA too. I mean, curators
Even as
were
a
expected
curator.
to fundraise, absolutely. Especially now when so much of fundraising is with private individuals, and we know people, and you know, as corporate monies, you know, have shrunk or almost virtually disappeared. Foundations have been hit. It's very much about individuals, and the curators know them, and often are expected to make, at least in my world, we're expected to make an ask.
You
Not
actually
just,
make
not just identify, but also make the ask.
Lynne, how much of your time
No?
Very little.
you're completely insulated from that?
Well, the museum is very largely funded by the state, and the idea of corporate funding or private individual funding is new, and it will grow, certainly. But at the moment, it's in a nascent condition.
At DIA, you didn't have to be too involved at DIA either, right?
Well, DIA is very small in
Yes.
terms of numbers of staff,
Right.
and the policy when I was there was always that the director was the most effective fundraiser, and he did the principal amount,
Right.
and that then the deputy director, and that all of us asking made for too many overlaps. It was much better directed through the director.
Klaus, do you have how much of your time do you have to devote in some way or another to dealing with trustees or donors?
I think I'm not fundraising. Like directly fundraising, I wouldn't be allowed to anyway because we have a department for this. I see it more so that I have a group, a relatively small group, not more than 20 people. Most of them are on our board of directors. And I think we are on a journey together, so metaphorically on a journey like what the institution will do, and then literally on a journey like, oh, we're all in Basel or we're all in Shanghai. And what my conviction is that you need a certain group of supporters, of artists, also of people being critical with you in order to get somewhere. So before you read something in the New York Times or FAZ, I rather hear it from my friends and hear it from my board and hear it from my artist friends. So I see everything like a journey, and you want to go to a studio visit together, and you see that exhibition in a gallery together. And so it's this very lively inner circle of perhaps 25 to 30 people. When I now think about it, it's more. But this group of artists and supporters and sometimes just like very frank people, I think carries the institution. And that comes from a European perspective, I think, but I brought it to America. And I couldn't do it differently, and it works. And it means that we come to a point where then I make an exhibition decision, I hope the people around the institution understand where that comes from, and I hope they understand when the exhibition goes a little wild or challenging, or I loved the way how you said, like, in Europe artists are respected and in America they are suspected. So I hope that group is always with me when I go makes that leap into suspicion with an artist. And I think, for example, MoMA PS1, which is 10 years with MoMA, but nobody really got it, and now it's really a name change. It's MoMA PS1, is actually free now to become much more European and international. It's going to be a Kunsthalle now, because I think the idea of a Kunsthalle is not really in America. It's not really which institution in America is really a Kunsthalle in a way, without a collection, without disconnected, rotating. So I think the fundraising, and I treat that the same in Europe as in the US, you need a certain group of people, and that might be your mayor in Amsterdam, or I don't know who it is in Madrid. You need to somehow share your thinking with them and get clear if this person supports it or not, and then you know what you can do.
Yeah, I want to ask two quick questions about this area before we move on. But before I do that, can I have a quick show of hands? Is anybody expecting to ask a question? If you're expecting to ask a question, raise your hand. So far, only 2 bidders. Okay, it's good. I'll keep that in mind. Just before we move on, 2 quick questions. One, simple yes, no, or very as sharply as you can. Is there a difference in decisions that go into acquisitions between the European, more public situation and the American, in terms of what the museum buys, or no?
I've found a big difference, but it's also, again, procedural, because at MOCA we had acquisition committees. The board had to approve acquisitions. At the Stedelijk Museum, it is the director's prerogative. So
Really?
that's it.
So if you say, I want a Frank Stella, you get your Frank Stella.
Yeah, I mean, I have to pay for it,
You
but
have to
I mean,
pay
I
for
would,
it.
yeah.
But you don't have
yeah.
to get it approved by
No,
a
I don't.
committee.
No, I am, and it's very funny because the curators have been accustomed to kind of a quick turnaround, and I'm always been on this 3 or 4 month cycle of acquisitions, and so they present something to me and like 2 days later say, well, what are you going to do? It was like, oh, I didn't realize I didn't have time to think about it. So
you're, again,
yeah.
I think you're dispelling myths again,
Yes.
because I think one would have been tempted to believe that the European scenario would be the more complicated scenario.
At least, well, I can't generalize, but I can speak about this specific situation. Yeah.
Klaus, can you have an acquisition without a committee deciding or approving?
I actually agree with Anne. America has a committee system, and in America an acquisition is considered as much a serious and longevity-driven decision like doing an exhibition. So it's a very important it's a very important activity. I would never do it without a committee.
Yeah.
But why? Either I have a good point and it's going to get acquired, or you can't make the point and perhaps it has a reason. No, I actually like the committee system.
Right. Okay, the other quick question, unless you have a thought on the acquisitions, what do you have a committee at Reina
There's a
Sofia?
board of trustees, yes.
At the
Yes.
Reina Sofia.
And the debate isn't usually about the cost of a work, it's about some historical issue
I
around
see.
it.
So back to the discourse
Yes,
aspect.
yeah.
Second quick question, and then we'll be ready to move on to the last area. Are there differences in how success is measured across the Atlantic?
No, I don't think
You
there
don't
are.
think
I
so?
still think it's public perception, it's professional recognition, it's, it's the same.
We have agreement there. Our first agreement?
I think so. I mean, I will say that the quantifiable is still present, and
in the U.S.?
in Europe
In
as
Europe?
well, as well.
What do you mean by quantifiable?
Meaning attendance, press, and so on. So I think that success is still those are still factors in how success is judged. Certainly that's very much also a way in the States, but I think that, again, it's each of our own inner compass and an institution's inner compass that I think needs to be perfectly calibrated to understand that how to judge your own success, not just based on what's quantifiable.
Right.
And so that, and if you get too far away from that, or too into the quantifiable, it's going to be a problem. So, but it is interesting because, you know, for the Stedelijk Museum, when we reopen, we're expected to have at least 600,000 visitors, which is a significant amount more than the museum has had historically, and that's also budgetary. So that's, you know, there's a budget based on a certain amount of income coming from a certain amount of visitors.
Right.
So it's there.
It's there.
It's there.
Okay, well, I want to now get to, in the limited amount of time we have left, to sort of the heart of the matter, which has to do with the differences in perceptions and responses to the art itself and how you present art. So my question, I tried to formulate it as simply as possible. Do you plan differently? Do you plan an exhibition differently when you're presenting it for a European audience or for an American audience?
First of all, I think your question about the success,
Yes.
I thought it's actually, we haven't finished that yet.
Go ahead.
because
It's a very important question.
I do see the question of success of a museum like an onion, like an onion with lots and lots of layers, and you can peel it and peel it. A museum like MoMA has approximately 3 million people a year, so that's a big onion. But I do think that success is not measured by the door, by the amount. It's not measured if Roberta Smith and Jerry Sauls like it or not. It's not the measure. I think when you peel the onion, you come to that little thing in the middle of the onion, and that's the art scene, that's the artist, and that's us, and it's a surprisingly small little middle of the onion. And it's more art scene legends, buzz, a fight, a confrontation. It's basically pushing the envelope in that small little middle of the onion that ultimately it means success, that you pushed it, that you moved it, that you made something that really changed perception. And that's not the 3 million people, that goes right in the middle of that onion. And if we have the impression, oh God, Lynne pushed the envelope, there was this controversial thing which was formerly so fantastic and I'm going to change my practice after I saw that, that's success. And that some institutions run on that little thing for 20 years and they run on this idea that this has happened there. Or
So that's very
But
interesting.
that's what I mean by professional.
Yeah.
The professional side of success. It's public and professional, and I think that's always there. It's colleagues. It's the world of those who know the history of exhibition making, acquisitions, museology.
I went yesterday to the Basquiat show, and there is this kind of spray-painted poster, New York New Wave. And I thought, oh God, Alana Heiss did that show with others at Piers 1, and here is the spray-painted Basquiat as an entrance to it. And that's a legend, long gone, but still these things run. And I think what you did at the DIA will put the DIA will run on this for a long time. And so it's that success. The success as a legend you cannot.
But it's not the numbers, and it's not the critics. So when do you know? When do you know that it's success?
Something creates a legend and a buzz. I remember I went to your Thomas Schütte show. That was just like, wow, middle of the onion, drop dead. That, no, you live on that for a long time.
Well,
I think.
But that's a very different measure of success than the one that you were alluding to.
Well, I of course, and I agree with my colleagues.
And it's a very optimistic.
My own kind of, I had to each of us have to figure out how we measure our success. And for me, I've always felt compelled that I must do what's historically necessary, and that I can justify it that I can justify it to artists, I can justify it to the people who know best, and then best serve it to a larger audience. But I would say that the people who support us, and our trustees and our stakeholders, do read the newspapers, do look at box office, and they also are affected by those numbers and by that quantifiable kind of part of things as a measure of success. And I think that we can't ignore it, but I think it's wonderful to hear that we all don't want to base our identity on it as well.
Yeah.
I remember when Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Nancy Spector, and I did the first Berlin Biennial. It was '98. The first review came out, and it says, "Oh God, an exploded children's room." And we were devastated. Then we went to the party, and everybody was in a good mood, and we said, like, fine. So I agree with Anne. Of course you're devastated for a day, but I think in the end, it's different parameters that decide success, and it's not numbers.
Well, point well taken. I do want to really wrap up on this issue, though, of you're having a conversation in a space with the help of objects with the public, and how do you consider that public? I mean, surely we already acknowledge some differences between what the public has tolerance for in the US versus Europe. Presumably there are differences in levels of education, but when it really comes right down to it, let's say if you were doing an experiment, you were doing the same exhibit, the same type of exhibition, starting from scratch, not a traveling show, in Europe versus the US, would that end up being the same exhibition? Or how exactly would you approach it differently?
I have an anecdote, but a short anecdote. The late Susan Sontag and I started doing an exhibition together, and she had been suffered through numerous illnesses, and it was very much about that. And the exhibition was called Into Me, Out of Me, but more like IV infusion and surgery and all of this. But then, of course, she was very close to Mapplethorpe when he was alive, and so the one gives the other, and it's clear what the exhibition in the end, in the spectrum, was about. So I first did it in New York, and unfortunately, sadly, Susan wasn't around anymore. So I thought, can I do the show? Yes, I'll do the show. But I didn't want to be afraid of including these pieces I knew were so important for her. So I put them all in, Peter Huja, Robert Mapplethorpe, everything. And I know the Warhol Foundation didn't want to give me the X portfolio, which is difficult. And then I showed them all the other images in the show, and they said, you can have the X portfolio. That's kind of like... And I was really, because America, and of course I was more aware at that point about this, I kind of showed it very shyly, and then it traveled to Berlin and Rome. And in Berlin, I basically put everything, Joseph Beuys, Robert Gober, and Robert Mapplethorpe. I'm not explaining which picture of Mapplethorpe, but I put them all together in the main space, and then I saw people being really shy about it. So sometimes it's just your idea. So you do things differently.
You mix them up,
When
you
it,
edit, you almost
when it
edit
moved to
differently.
Rome, all the pictures were gone. I was not the curator anymore. I went to the show, I said, oh God, this is not the show. So.
Well, since we seem to be ending on anecdotes, do you have similar types of stories from your own experience where you had to sort of change the optics around the show depending on where you were presenting it?
I think the best thing I've discovered is the lack of barriers, plinths, security devices in front of objects, and that hanging a large show of Juan Munoz's work, the one piece that came needed a big barrier around it. It was from an American private collection, and it was wrecking the piece, and I was at the point of thinking, I'm going to take the piece out. It's just, compared with everything else, you can't see it. And by a miracle, the collectors happened to be stranded in Madrid airport that day and walked into the museum, and I was able to say, can we please take the barriers away? There are no other barriers around works in this whole show. And they said yes. And I know I wouldn't have managed it if they hadn't been on site. But the fantastic thing is, there's something, there are a great many people coming through the museum, but the works have never been damaged that I've seen. And there's a different way of traffic patterning. I don't know why, but the access to work seems much more immediate, and there's much more preemptive fear about what might happen if somebody did
It's a
something.
liability thing.
Yeah, it's great. It really is.
I'm kind of preparing for the future, so I haven't had the experience yet of seeing how people and art mix in the museum. But we're in the midst of planning a temporary public program in the Stedelijk Museum's old building this fall. So it's an interesting process to actually just start to get the machine running and talk to staff and all the different staff that are in a different, those who protect the objects and want to talk about barriers, those who want to talk about education, those talking about language in the galleries, and so on. So I'm how to receive visitors when we haven't received them in this building for 6 years. So we're kind of in a very structural moment of preparing, and I'm very curious to see because in many ways it's also about this fall will really be about reintroducing a museum that's been absent for so many years, and what that's about is very much what we're trying to engage people in.
Well, I think, first of all, can you all hear us? Because we're starting to hear more of the fair. So maybe this signals that it's time for the audience, the voice of the audience to be heard. Lady in the front, could you tell us who you are before you ask your question? And if you know who you're asking it from, do say so.
Okay, I will try. My name is Susanne Kaufmann. I'm working for the Southwest Broadcasting Company in Stuttgart, radio journalist in the field of culture. I have 2 questions to Klaus Biesenbach concerning the field public-private. The first one, in Germany we have actually an increasing number of private museums. Just last week was the opening of the Arthur Walter photo collection curated by Ocwi and Wesor in Neu-Ulm. We have the big Schauwerk near Stuttgart with 3,000 tremendous works. The public really didn't know what to say anymore, especially in the contrast of what public museums own. My question to you, Mr. Biesenbach, is there a similar development in the United States with private museums of private collectors, or do private collectors in the States try to get a powerful position more in public museums in the field of trustees?
I answer with an artist, and it's not a nice answer, but I think I'm convinced about this. When I drove into Basel, there's a Felix González Torres poster, "Es ist nur eine Frage der Zeit," it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. I'm absolutely convinced important works of art should be in major publicly accessible museums and nowhere else, not on somebody's couch, not in somebody's private museum. These museums did not calculate the next 20 years. They don't know about conservation. Most of them, they don't know about different equipment needs changing, different works disintegrating. Very, very, very few of these private museums will grow and be institutions. It's only a matter of time. I think the other works will happily come back to the museums that are accessible for the public.
This is actually a very important question, so if either of you have a thought on this, and then Klaus has a strong opinion too. Do you agree?
I think you expressed it very well. I agree.
And I express this with every collector and every private museum. I don't like important pieces on top of somebody's couch. I just don't like it, and they have to come back.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up? I think we'll move on. Okay. Just sorry, it's in the interest of time. Could you mention who you are and your question?
My name is Maria Veronica León. I am an artist from Ecuador living in Paris since '98. I have two questions, and I think that you already touched one of them, but more than cultural difference between two continents, institutional policies difference or budget difference, I would like to know where and how, if it's possible, is the difference in terms of choice, curate, invite artists. American museums and European museums has a different repertoire of art and artists in favor of their own interest. I am talking about the difference inside the institution that you deal with. The preference of the European cultural system, how it affects in your choice. That is one question. And the second question is, what is the type of influence that you think you are living in Europe? Are you proposing different projects of organization, or you just follow the policies of Europe some way imposed? And that's it. Do you think that your presence is the result also of the necessity of an international exchange between Europe and America? Thank you.
I can only answer this because I see Patricia Sloan, who half a year ago showed me perhaps one of the futures of museums and institutions, a fantastically generous, beautifully equipped museum in Mexico City, MOCA, that is connected to one of the biggest university campuses in the world, and they have 300,000 grad students there every day. And I have to say, I was so charmed, first of all, by the quality of the work, by the approach of having the audience live with it and use it. And I can only applaud Patricia as a model that I would dream would be in many more places. And I think you have such a specific question, but you really should look at a place like this, and there are so many answers.
Anybody else have a reflection on this issue?
Go ahead. I couldn't quite hear all of your question, I'm so sorry, but I think part of maybe what you were asking is how we envision ourselves more internationally and also internal decisions.
Yeah.
I think that coming in as a new director, everybody's looking for my vision, asking what am I going to do, and I'm very much I want to make the transition and find the right way to listen, to feel, to learn the environment. I've come into a situation that's been very interesting to me, coming into a closed museum that has actually kind of gotten more. We've thought about the Stedelijk Museum as a very international institution in its history, but it became, I think, much more, in many ways, kind of inward-looking, and Amsterdam has become inward-looking, and I'm learning the culture of the institution. I'm learning the culture of a city. I'm learning the culture of a country that's in a very interesting, complex moment culturally. So I'm trying to take it in, I'm not in to make kind of broad, sweeping changes, but to start to shift things and make the changes more on a case-by-case basis that can start to just kind of transform the institution. I want it to be an international institution in Amsterdam. I want it to be but it is an institution of its city as well. It serves a local community and it serves an international audience as well, and it should be there in all of those ways. So I'm finding my path. So.
And I think that is probably something that could be said of any museum.
Yeah.
And it's time for us to let you back into the fair. I just want to say, as I thought we would be able to scratch the surface of some of these issues, but I do think we were able to touch on several dimensions. I myself am not sure if America and Europe are different or less different than I thought when we began this conversation, but I certainly feel that we perhaps managed to dispel some myths and stereotypes about Europe and America. So with that, I'd like to thank each of the panelists and thank all of you, and have a wonderful time at the fair.
Thank you. András, thank you.
Yes.